All right, welcome to Words of the Wise. Today's guest is Doug Shoemaker. He's the former chief of police for Denton PD and Grand Junction PD, and he is the former fifth, fourth, and third vice president of IACP, which is International Association Chief of Police. Welcome to the show, Doug Shoemaker. Thank you so much for being here.
Great. Thanks, Paige. I'm thrilled to be here. So this is going to be a lot of fun. We'll have some good talks here.
I'm so excited. And I know that you have such a passion for wellness and a really high
Mhm.
level of understanding when it comes to first responder wellness, law enforcement wellness. So I'm really excited to dive into today's topics. But before we do that, I would love to give our listeners some background on you. How long were you in this profession and why law enforcement?
Yeah, well, it's a funny story, I suppose, but served 33 years in policing through three different agencies, starting in Missouri, state capital, Missouri, Jefferson City, and went there for about 27, and then went to become the chief in Grand Junction, then in Denton. So you saw a lot during those years, as you would imagine. There were so many different things that you experience in that span. And really, I think the funny part for me is that I, I had, while I'd always thought about policing, it was one of those careers. I was actually pre-med for a while in college. And then, I just realized that probably wasn't the best fit for me. And of all things, graduated college with a degree in English Lit. So it was the most non-police degree you could possibly get, and then going into police work. But I tell you what drew me was the really the people that I knew in the agencies that I knew them from, and kind of their dedication and devotion to try and solve problems and help people in the community. And that really resonated with me a lot as something that was really mission driven and something maybe I was kind of seeking out at the time. So while it was not planned to go that direction, it certainly did. And, there's a lot of experiences during that time. So I'm thankful and grateful for that.
And I think too, sometimes the best things happen, and I say in quotes like by chance, but I also personally don't believe in chance. And I believe that everything happens the way it's meant to. And so it seems to me that this is exactly where you were meant to be. And you had a long 33 years that were really successful in this career. So even though it wasn't planned, it sounds like it was really a good thing.
It was a good thing. And, as with anybody that serves in the policing profession, I think there's so many things you look back on, and a lot of the experiences, some really great, some really terrible, just because of the nature of policing. But I'm thankful to have done it. Grateful, particularly for the people that helped me along the way too, because there were many of those folks. You never get to this position without somebody helping you or being a mentor or being a guide for you. Probably multiple people. So I'm very grateful for that.
I love that. And I know you mentioned like the ups and downs, and there's so many good things, but there's also so many terrible things. And we know that in this profession you experience a lot. And what did that do for your own wellness over time, over those 33 years? How did those experiences on the job impact your physical and mental health?
Back when I started, we didn't talk about wellness. And when we did, it was simply who could, run the fastest mile and a half or who could bench press the most in the gym. And that was wellness. We didn't talk about the after effects of a critical incident or a shooting or responding to a child death or a fatal crash or anything like that at all. You just did it. And it was we'll call it the suck it up buttercup kind of mentality of the day. And so just because we didn't talk about it doesn't mean it doesn't weigh on you after a while, certainly. And they say that the average person sees maybe two to three to maybe four serious traumatic events or experiences something that's so very traumatic in their lifetime. But police professionals see it sometimes daily, and throughout the course of multiple decades of our career, that stuff adds up. And the emotional and physical toll, whether it's shift work and the irregular hours, the irregular sleeping, the irregular eating, the bad habits that come with it, all the things on top of the emotional or psychological stresses that we see. It's probably why we have kind of a lower age that we tend to live to in this profession, which is, I think, unf certainly it's unfortunate, but it's also probably avoidable if we just take some steps. And I think we are starting to do some of those things, such as the work that you're doing, for example, with Firstgevity and so many in the space that are just taking wellness much more seriously than we used to and having open conversations.
Yeah, and I 100% agree. I mean, I started working in this wellness space 8 years ago. And even in the last 8 years, I've seen the progression and the momentum moving in the right direction.
Mhm.
So I agree with you that I think things are changing and there's now conversations like these that are happening,
Yeah.
and leaders like yourself who are um, talking and being vulnerable and, and bringing it up as a high priority where it doesn't seem like that was something that happened before. And I think the more that we can talk about it and, the more that we can focus on solutions, then the better it's going to be long term, obviously. I mean, we've seen that in the last 8 years. So I agree with you that there's been forward progress. Um, I know that, you said that there was this like rub dirt on it mentality. And you came from an era of policing that didn't really focus on it. How did you get into this space now where wellness is such a high priority for you? Like, why did wellness become so important to you personally?
I think you start to see as you go through the ranks, you start to see the impact from a different level than when you're just doing it. When you're a line officer, patrol officer, what you experience is what you experience, and you see it from that level. And when there's no, I don't want to say support because it sounds like a harsh term, but when there's really no discussion, when there's no vulnerability about it from a higher level, then it seems, yeah, I'll be fine. It's no big deal, right? Everybody goes through this. It's great. But when you start climbing the ranks and you start to see how things affect people, whether it's how they come to work, whether it's their demeanor, whether it's how maybe it might be affecting them at home, and you really start to pay attention to the people that surround you, your colleagues, if you're a supervisor, the people that you lead, for example, you start to take notice and go, maybe we're not doing such a great job in this space, and maybe we should have some conversations about it. And I think for me, that's where the challenge of trying to create a feeling of vulnerability while still trying to do what is an extraordinarily difficult job became a bit of a more of a mission. And I think that's where I really took that seriously on a lot of levels, both with work with the ICP, but also working within the agencies where I was fortunate enough to serve. So it was a long process, though. This was not a, hey, we should talk about wellness. Everybody's like, oh, I totally thought about the same thing too, right?
Right.
It was quite the opposite. And for a long time, oh no, you become vulnerable with something that means you're weak. And nobody wants to be surrounded by that on a job where the next call you could be shot at and you're in a firefight or whatever else that could happen. So it's been a long, long process.
And I do think that that word vulnerability has been so relevant lately. Almost every conversation I've had with leadership has surrounded around that of like being authentic and being vulnerable and changing the perception of what vulnerability is because you can be vulnerable and incredibly strong and tough at the same time. It's not one or
Mhm.
the other. Not just because you're vulnerable means that now all of a sudden you're not strong and capable. And so I think that that perception is changing a lot. I don't know if you feel that same way, but that's what I've seen. That's like everyone's coming forward and being like, hey, like we got to talk about it and we got to be vulnerable and we got to change that perception of what vulnerability is.
Yeah, if I were to draw it out like a whiteboard, I would write the word vulnerability and then does not equal weakness. Those two
Right.
things are totally separate. Um, we all have moments we experience weakness, but vulnerability is I think, the ability to just be very open about things that are challenging for you personally and letting other people into the space of allowing for empathy to deal with certain situations. And I think back to a specific time in Grand Junction when I was the chief there, and we talked to folks in both agencies that I led. We talked to folks about what wellness really meant to them. And in Grand Junction, we brought in clinicians, licensed clinicians. To spend, they would rotate once a month. There were four of them. They rotated once a month and would come in and do a certain amount of time within the police department to be in an office and just be available to talk about things. And, while there are a number of people that said that's a great idea, there was still a little bit of time that it took to really take hold and for people to go, okay, yeah, I'll be the first to walk in and have a conversation with this person. And it was a little strange at first, I think, for people. But after a while, the funny thing is once more people started to do it, and once the clinicians did the write outs with the officers and all the things, soon we would have, our toughest SWAT officers walking in there and having a conversation and walking into briefing with our four new hires and saying, yeah, I just went and talked to the clinician about some stuff that I'm dealing with. And everybody's going, well, if the SWAT guy can go in there and do it and just be open about it, like, yeah, I'm dealing with that. Maybe it's okay. And I think it's more than half the battle sometimes because, I mean, you are in an environment where that team matters. This is not a solo sport. This is a team sport. No police officer that's going to be successful acts as just one person. They have other people they rely on, many times potentially for their own life. And so that team aspect, that cohesiveness, and that genuine care for one another has to be there. So being vulnerable has some risks associated with it. But if you're in a safe space where it's okay and you're allowed to do it and it becomes part of the culture, part of the norm, that's where the win is, I think.
Yeah, and I love that you said team because I think that sometimes you get in a space where, especially if you're struggling with things, where it's very isolating, like you feel like you're on your own island, and to recognize that you guys are a team and you have to look out for each other and lean on each other. But I also think that it's so powerful to say that, like, you know, you have the ability to make people feel comfortable and to change that team dynamic in a healthy way. How important do you think it is for leadership to be participating in these wellness initiatives?
100% important. That without buy-in from the top and not just all right, I put out a policy on wellness, go forth and be well. That's just it doesn't go anywhere and it doesn't really have any effect. And so I think with the higher you go in an organization, being the chief and being vulnerable can really come with some significant risks because
Mhm.
some people would say, "Jeez, this guy's lost his mind. What's he talking about? Like he's leading us and he's got these issues he's dealing with." And I'm not saying you pour your inner soul out necessarily, but certainly saying, yeah, you know what? I went through a rough time losing my dad. And I would use this analogy. And I had to talk to somebody about it because I just wasn't processing that loss well at all. Like I wasn't getting through it the way I thought that I needed to get through it. And I felt like there were some challenges that I couldn't overcome. So for me, that's what I deal with. And everybody everywhere has something that's affected them in some way. And some people maybe need to rise to that level to talk to somebody or to just at least get it out to a confidant or a friend or somebody they trust. But the folks that hold it in the longest are the folks that unfortunately we see that still in this day and age, we're losing cops to suicide routinely, and it's becoming a real challenge.
Yeah, and I think that, we hear this expression of like, it's okay to not be okay. I also think it's okay to be okay, and things are going to impact people differently. And so I think there's both sides of it. But I think that the thing is that as an organization, you can create a space that when people do feel okay, they feel safe and they
Mhm.
feel good. And when they don't feel okay and they need resources, they also feel safe. And like there's resources that they can grab to like gravitate towards, and there's not going to be that judgment or that shame attached to it.
Yes, absolutely. And having the ability to provide both of those things, I think, is really, really important.
Yeah. And you mentioned you mentioned two things I want to talk about. One was as a leader, being able to recognize when people maybe are going through a hard time, when maybe they're not acting the same, their demeanor is off. And we know that some leaders are really involved and some maybe aren't so much. How important do you think it is to be like in the middle of it where you are communicating and talking to people and being able to see that? And as agencies get bigger, how, as a leader from a large organization, can you do that where you can be able to recognize if someone's not okay within your organization?
I think that's where the top-down approach of really showing the buy-in comes into play. Not only And let's look at this really objectively and realistically. An agency of 1,000 officers and a chief, they're probably not going to see the chief that often. I mean,
Mhm.
especially the officers on the midnight shift, they're working from 9 at night till 7 in the morning or something, for example, and the chief generally is never working then because that's not what his or her job is meant to be. That's just this is a part of it. Um, Sure, they come out and do ride outs, and I did the same thing, but it was infrequent, and that's sandwiched in between all the other responsibilities that we have to do to lead an agency. So that's where the culture of the agency itself really takes such a high priority, and making sure that all the leaders directly below that chief or that sheriff are on board with, look, this is the direction we're going to go, and let's have some open conversations about what this looks like and how we can help our people. Because at the end of the day, it's something I always told the officers that worked for me. I said, look, I work for you just as much as you work for me. So it's got to be a symbiotic relationship, and I need to be able to be here to support you just as much as I need to trust you to go out and do the right thing ethically and morally on the daily basis. And so, but we got to work together on that, and that has to be a thing. So I think as long as that's understood within the command staff, the group of officers and lieutenants, captains, majors, et cetera, right beneath the chief and the kind of hierarchical structure that we have. And then as long as that passes down appropriately and that message is received by the first line supervisors, because quite frankly, the first line supervisors are, I think, the two most important groups within a police agency are the first line supervisors and the field training officers. Not the chief, not the deputy chief, but those two ranks, because the first line supervisors really control what happens. They lead the people out doing the job on a daily basis, directly, routinely, and they see everything that happens in such a way that the folks above them just don't see it. And so they recognize challenges, they recognize greatness, they recognize all these different things. The field training officers are leading the future generations of the agency and passing that culture along the right way. So those are the key roles. And if they get it, then I think you're going to have an agency that's much more successful in understanding the importance of wellness, because they set up that ability to be empathetic, that ability to be okay, and to have some level of compassion. And I fully realize those are weak words in some ways to some people, but it's the actual opposite. It takes a lot of power to express those things appropriately as opposed to weakness, like we talked about earlier.
I 100% agree. And I think everything that I was hearing when you were talking just circled back to team. You guys are a team working together to create this safe space, this culture of wellness. You're working together to support each other. So I agree with you, and I loved everything that you just said about that, because I do think that even more than a team, you guys are a family. You got to look out
Yeah,
for each other. But
yeah.
you've said a couple times buy-in. This is a big topic across the board is buy-in. How do we get buy-in? How do we get people to prioritize wellness? What do you think, in your opinion, is the biggest challenge that agencies are facing today when it comes to implementing wellness programming?
I think it's a lack of understanding of what it is that you're trying to accomplish, and also a lack of agreement on what is wellness. And in both agencies that I've led, we created internal surveys to say, what does it mean to you? And whether you're talking psychological wellness, whether you're talking physical wellness, spiritual, financial, it runs the gamut of all these different things because it means something different to people. Somebody might be struggling with something maybe in their marriage and they're dealing with some things. Somebody might be struggling with, I'm physically not where I want to be and I don't feel physically well and I just want to get better. I want to eat healthier. I want to do all these types of things. And that might be their focus. And none of these are wrong answers. But unless we ask the question, then we're guessing. And for me to come in as a chief and say, okay, this is what wellness needs to be. I think we need to, bring in clinicians and we're just going to approach it from a psychological wellness perspective. Well, I'm going to miss some people and shame on me for not asking the question. So I think it's when I say buy-in, I think it means being able to not only ask the question and having as a chief, when you put out a survey, sometimes you don't know what you're going to get back, and you're like, okay, this is a level of vulnerability for me when you put something out and then say, all right, everybody speak. And sometimes you get answers back that can be a little like harsh about where the agency currently stands or kind of critical in some ways. sometimes those criticisms are like, yeah, you said it, and that's probably where we are. And so let's have that conversation. Let's talk about the why. And that's something I'm really big on is having an open conversation about this is the why of what we're doing. And I never wanted to put programs in place because it was the cool thing to do or it checked a box. It just felt like that was a waste of energy and time. But what if we talked to everybody to say, what's our mission and where are our hearts at, and what do we really truly want to be? What do we want to be? Um, and I always ask the question, and I'll circle back to this, but I think it's relevant. Whenever I would bring somebody on board, I would always say, I want you to think about, really what your why is, what motivates you, and where you see yourself down the road, and where you think you contribute to this, and then how you think we can best help you accomplish that mission. What's that look like? And I think the more you ask the questions and are open with those cultural aspects, I just think you're going to have so much more success. But not being afraid of asking the why and not being afraid of having the conversations because the message is missed sometimes. And it's up to the higher ups in the administration to make sure that that's pushed down through the ranks to make sure that everybody within the organization, whether it's your line officers, whether it's your records personnel, your crime analysts, your professional staff, and your sworn staff, both dispatchers, all the other people that make it all work, everybody needs to kind of have a say in that, I think, in terms of how are we doing? How are we really? And then if we're having challenges, why?
I love that you said why. I literally wrote why like at the bottom and like because there's a few things. One, I agree that like asking everyone and including the entire organization is so important. A
Yep.
lot of times when we talk about wellness, and there's even, grants and things out there that really only focus on sworn personnel. And I think that if we go back to that idea of team, you guys all work together as a team. That includes everybody. So I love that you said that. But one of the things that I do is I ask that why? Like, what is your why? And I think you can ask different whys. But when it comes to wellness, I think it's so important for people to have a deeper meaning behind what they're doing. And I know a lot of academies will ask you the same thing as far as like your why for entering into this profession and attaching to that. And maybe that changes over time, but having that deeper reason that you can refer back to. And I think that when it comes to wellness, it's just as important to ask yourself, why is this important to me? It's not always um, the what or the how, but the why. And I
Yeah.
think that is so different for everybody. And for someone to come up, like if I get in front of people and I'm like, hey, I think that this is important. And therefore, I think you should think that this is important. Everyone's
Right.
just going to blink at me because they're going to be like, I don't know you. I mean, obviously, I'm an outsider coming in, but they're like, I don't know you.
Right.
And so I will never get up in front of people and say, hey, I think that you should prioritize this. I ask the question, why is wellness important to you? Is it performance on the job? Is it retirement? Is it your family? Like, what is your why? And then how can we help you to accomplish that? What are
Yep.
some resources that we can put in place that help to, get you to that goal, of retirement or, being there for your family longer or whatever that is. So I love that you said why, and I had written that down before you even said it. So I feel like we're like super in line with
We are
that.
on the same page here, that's for sure. And I appreciate the fact that you reemphasize the issue of bringing in not just the sworn officers, but everybody. And I was never in dispatch. I could never do the job because I can't multitask to the level that's required of them. And they have this amazing skill set that, thank goodness, it's there because I mean they bring it. They're the first responders, really. They're the ones getting the 911 calls. They're sending the officers. They're dealing with things as they come constantly in. So we wanted to make sure in both agencies that our dispatchers were able to be a part of this because for patrol officers, we would go to a scene, let's call it a fatal car crash for sake of conversation. We'd process it, we'd deal with it, we'd deal with all the things afterwards, but there was closure to it because they were physically there and they were dealing with it. The dispatcher, by the time that fatal crash has been dispatched, is on to multiple calls afterwards.
Right.
And there's never any true closure to this. How's that weighing on you after a while? And so that is important to talk about. And we don't want to forget them because they're absolutely part of our team. Our records personnel that are transcribing reports of horrific things that are happening to people and to children and all that stuff. Our crime scene techs, it's one big team.
Yep.
And one thing we did in Grand Junction, I was really impacted by a speaker. He's a sheriff in a county in northern New York State, and he spoke at an FBI trainer course that I was at, and it was right after I'd lost my dad, and I went to the last leg of this course, and he was talking about wellness and suicide and all these things, and it was like a smack across the face for me, and I was like, oh. I am not doing great on some things. And so I had a great conversation with him. He's fantastic. Um, and I said, I think the folks that I work with need to hear this type of message maybe. And he says, I talk about this all over the country. So we flew him out to Grand Junction all the way from New York, and Grand Junction's not easy to get to. But we brought him in and we did an invite internally. And I said, look, I know this guy. He's talked about wellness. This is going to be a challenging topic for some people to hear because he talks about his personal issues with it, losing a friend to things, and just the wellness space, period. I said, it's tough to listen to, but I think it's important. Not mandatory, but if you want to come, sign up. And this is anybody in the department, not just sworn, but everybody in the department. But I also want you to consider if you want to bring your significant other. And I say that because I think that sometimes family members of first responders are forgotten in this picture,
Yeah.
but they suffer the same level of vicarious trauma because that cop is coming home and they've dealt with stuff all day and they don't want to talk about it because that's what we do. We don't want to talk about it. And they act differently and they treat you differently. And yet we have these people supporting us the whole way. And so bringing in families and the reaction. I mean, both of the classes we had a day session and a night session, and both of them were packed. And we had so many family members come in. And in my entire career, I've never had so many emails afterwards to say, that was awesome. Thanks. And that
That's
was it. That's
great.
all I needed to hear. But it was this guy's message that was so impactful and so important. And the willingness to say, let's have an open conversation here and let's bring our boyfriend, girlfriend, wife, sister, I don't, whatever it happened to be. And I think it made a difference. So again, I think we're starting to do better. And I think those types of things and being willing to take those moments of vulnerability to try something like that as appropriate, of course, was important.
I love that. And I agree with you. I think that home wellness is something that's not often talked about, but everyone has a home to go to. And we
Mhm.
want to make sure that that stays as intact and healthy as possible. So I love that you
Yep.
included family members, and I'm sure that they appreciated that too. And it was an opportunity for them to come together and bond as a family unit, and listen to a conversation about wellness. And it's maybe something that could have brought them closer together and something that could have benefited their home life. So I love that you
Yep.
did that. And I 100% agree that it's not often talked about is,
Yep.
how can we support? And not only that, but it's like, how can we also give resources ongoing to spouses and kids? How
Mhm.
can we make sure, because they're, like you said, they're stressed out dealing with you, so how do we
Yeah.
also make sure that they're supported?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, you're on shift work, you're missing events, you're not seen as much because you're on some night shift or swing shift or whatever it happens to be. And you're working long hours and probably working overtime, giving staffing shortages for the most part across the country still to some extent. So it is challenging. It's not just on the person doing the job.
Right, 100%.
Yep.
How do you think wellness or the lack of wellness resources impacts performance on the job?
It, that's a great question. And I'm trying to think of the best way to say it. I think the more as leaders that we do to empower and make the people that work with us, our colleagues, and I don't like, I'm very hesitant to say the people that work for me because it sounds callous and I don't like that. I always call people my colleagues because we all work together. We're all trying to do the same thing. We just have different ranks. So for me, making sure that your colleagues feel like they're supported and empowered to do the job can make a huge level of difference in their desire or ability to go out and make those tough choices. Because let's be honest, as the chief, I was rarely ever out there for some critical incident at the time it happened where some split second decision had to be made, but they are. And if they don't feel like they're supported or that 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 they're safe to go do what they need to do, whatever it happens to be, that's going to end up in bad decisions. That's going to end up in people getting hurt. That there's all kinds of repercussions that can come from that. So I think wellness starts with feeling supported and feeling like, the folks that are leading the organization truly have your back. And I'm not at all talking about things that are unethical or immoral. I'm talking about just doing the job. And that's tough in this day. um, when people aren't performing at their best, if they don't feel like they're supported, if they don't get the number of days off they need, because yeah, I know, and I was the same way when I started, when I was a cop. You could have told me to work every day, every week, and every shift, and I'd be like, yes, please, let me do this because I loved being a cop. Would that have been healthy? No, because I needed to have friends outside the profession. I needed to see family. I needed to do other things and just not wrap my identity up as Doug the police officer, but there's still just Doug the person. And I think making sure that we give people that room to step away from the job, to have their own lives, to have time away to, refresh and reset in healthy, positive ways is just as important as that support from the top to say, when you're here and doing the job, I'll make sure you're trained the best I possibly can. Make sure you're supported. Whatever you need from us, we got your back. I think all those things really come into play because, you've seen the headlines of officers that are just not doing great for whatever reason. They make a poor decision. They care less. They're rude to people. They abuse their powers as a police officer, and those things never ever end well. So that personal wellness piece, I think, is just in this line of work is so very important.
Yeah, and I love how you talked about a couple things. One, making sure you have wellness and support within your organization. And you talked about decision making a lot. That was something that you said a couple times, like how that impacts your decision making on the job, and how you respond to situations and how you interact with people, in your community. But then also having that time away from the job. And I do agree with you that both of those are so important, and it could be a matter of life or death, and we don't want to be dramatic, but it's the reality of it. It's like
Yeah.
you have to make these really challenging split second decisions, and so you have to make sure that mentally you are as fit and well as possible. And then of course, like we know physically, you want to be able to perform the functions of your career too and to stay safe. But
Sure.
decision making and safety were the two things that kind of popped out with what you were saying.
Yeah. And I think the friendships, cops want to hang around cops because they want to talk about it and they want to talk about what happened after work and go out to dinner and go to the bar or whatever else they want to do. But I think it's so important for people to have and policing to have friends that are not at all affiliated with policing. And so it's great you have your friends at the DA's office or at the sheriff's office if you're in the police department, but maybe you have, your other friend who, I don't know, he's an artist or she's an accountant or whatever else it happens to be. It doesn't matter. And don't talk about police work when you're off. Just step away from it because I think, and I've been guilty of it too, of having that identity become almost overtake who you are as a person, and who you are becomes that. And someday that's going to go away. And when you leave the profession, that's gone. And if you don't have those other people in your life, those other hobbies, those other passions outside of policing, it gets pretty dark and it's not a lot of fun. So you have to have those things to just be a more holistically well person, I think.
Yeah, and I've actually heard that piece of advice a couple of times, and it sounds to me it's like you need that space of like grounding almost, of like having like knowing that you are not just a job, like you are also a person, and having that grounding space of like, hey, like I am a person outside of this as well.
Right.
And they're both equally as important. I want to ask you a couple questions about organization because I agree with you that there have been huge strides happening, in wellness over the past decade or so. I know California is ahead of the curve and has been kind of leading that charge, in kind of the west side of the country. But if an agency, because one of the challenges I think is always going to be budget, how do you fit this into your budget so that you can support your people? And if there's an agency that's struggling with funding, what advice would you give them to be able to, find the resources so that they can invest in their people's wellness?
I think the most important thing first is to figure out what it means. What's the most impactful thing they can do for their agency?
Mhm.
And I think that's going to require the chief, sheriff, whomever, to really reach down to the folks that are out there experiencing probably the greatest level of trauma within an organization, and then having the conversation of what's this look like for you? And because I think sometimes, we see training opportunities, and there are many fantastic training opportunities through IACP or Police Executive Research Forum, PERF, et cetera, et cetera. All these formal organizations, and I'm an IACP member, have been for almost 20 years, and the trainings are great, but that the training will not solve all the problems. I think there's a deeper level of coaching and engagement that can come from non-traditional trainings, um, such as like what you're doing in the space, that can have a much deeper impact on long-term success. Uh, but I think you need to know really what that means to the organization. And I say tread cautiously with that, because I think asking the question before, like we discussed earlier, making the decision is really, really important, because it can touch a nerve with some people, and it can put some people off, and there might be different camps of people within the agency. Maybe some of the salty old timers, I can say that because I'm older, and
We all
they
feel
might
the
say, well, I
love.
don't know. Mentally, certainly not. But they'll say, well, we don't need that. That's not what we need. But then, you have a newer generation coming in that wants to feel like they're a part of something. And, this is the same generation that's leaving jobs because of terrible bosses and terrible cultures, because they want to find a place where they're making a difference. And it feels like they're doing something positive and productive. And I'm not saying they're the pat on the back group, but that you want to feel like you're going someplace and you're doing something that's truly making a difference. And I think that gap between the two is so wide, but I definitely think that asking the question, and budgets are tight on some of those levels, but I think by the same token, it comes to, having run budgets for police agencies for a while, I think it comes down to triaging what's most important. And at the end of the day, your people are most important. And yes, that new piece of equipment would be awesome, but if that costs a lot of money and you can soak that into some sort of a wellness initiative that could have maybe a deeper impact across a broader spectrum, let's think about this a little bit, and let's talk about what that looks like and what has the bigger impact. Because remember, without the people, this job does not work. It's not the cool toys that we have. It's not all that stuff. It's the amazing individuals, women and men, that go out there and throw on a badge and a gun and a vest, and on the daily go do heroic things that you never see on the news. And I mean everything from major saving the baby from the car stuff to the moment where we go out and we see people on their absolute worst day in their life. And when we do that, we have to be there for them in a way that um, is so impactful that we can help mitigate some of that pain and that stress, not to alleviate it, but to be that professional that can help them get through something that absolutely impacts them. And if we equip our folks, again, those first line folks at all levels within the organization, whatever role it happens to be, to do those things, that investment is going to pay tenfold, not only for the department, but for the community that we serve. So triaging the importance of those spends is important, and be aggressive with grants. Don't just pull up a grant like federal grants website and go, well, there's nothing there, I don't see anything. No, dig in and start asking questions and ask people, and seek out best practices, whether it's at a conference. And I know you and I've talked about a few different conferences here and there, but ask the questions and be bold, and take some risks on trying different things, and seeing what works best for your individual agency, because every agency is different.
Thank you for that reminder to anyone who's listening that the people are the most important. I think that is such a powerful reminder for everyone to
Yep.
hear. It's like yes, your people are your greatest asset, and how can you support them? And I also love the it's not a one size fits all, and I completely agree that that's going to look different for everyone. But as long as you're
Mm.
prioritizing your people and what's important to them and their why, then you can always, make it happen and find the funds one way or another, whether that's through, like you said, kind of reallocating funds from maybe equipment to wellness or being aggressive with grant funding. So thank you for that. I think that was great. And I want to talk a little bit because you were talking about the new generation. I know like recruitment and retention is a topic right now. And I think that all generations are mission driven. I think you're correct that the newer generation maybe has a little bit more of like, what are you going to do for me mentality, and it has more of that like work-life balance maybe is what I'm hearing, which is not a negative at all.
Right.
But I do think that even you coming in saying like, man, I just loved, and I wrote it down. You said, I loved the dedication and the devotion and the mission driven nature of the people I knew that were in law enforcement. And so I think that whether someone is like you who's been on the in this career for a long time or someone who's up and coming, I think that that is important to feel like you're a part of something and that you can make a true difference in the world and being able to support that. Um, how much do you think wellness plays into retaining staff and then hiring new recruits or employees within an organization?
I think it plays a huge part in who we get and who we retain. And recruitment and retention are different, but yet there's some similarities and some common themes that run through both of those different topics. And the one thing I love about the newer generation when I was in that position and hiring people, because I did one-on-ones with every single person that I would hire into the sworn positions. And I did that because I felt I wanted to connect with them to see what their why was. And I would ask them, what motivates you? Tell me, if you have a task in front of you and you have a challenge that comes in front of you, what do you draw upon within yourself, despite all these different obstacles that you see? What gets you through that? What's that look like for you?
Mm.
And the stories that I would hear from them about their backgrounds or their past or what motivates them for so many different reasons were great. And the one thing I loved was that they weren't afraid to ask questions. And full disclosure, some of the chiefs that I know were like, I don't like, don't ask me, I'm the chief. I'm like, it's not how that works. When you have people that ask you the questions, they want to know the why, don't be afraid of it. Jump in with that because that means they're invested in, tell me what our mission is. Tell me what's our vision? What are we aspiring to become? And how can I be a part of that? And so when you explain the why, I think most every single time that I would say, if they'd say, well, I don't know if I love the way we're going with this, say, well, let's have a conversation about it. And here's kind of the why behind it. And then afterwards they'd say, oh, I totally get that. That makes sense. But the ability to ask the why, I love it because you could kind of see into people to see why they're asking those questions and what motivates them. And some of the older generation would just say, stupid policy, and they just go along with it, and that would be the end of it. But some of the younger generations would question things, say, well, what if we could do it a little better? And what if that line officer that's actually out there doing the job might have an idea that could be, oh, we never thought about that. And all of a sudden it's like, yeah, let's run with this. And there were several occasions where we had that very thing happen, where somebody said, hey, what if we could do this a little differently? And then say, okay, don't bring me a problem, bring me a solution. And say,
Mhm.
all right, so this is like a project now. And they come back and they have these amazing thoughts on why we do things. Like we changed to outer carriers in Grand Junction, and I will tell you up front, I was totally opposed to it because I didn't love how they looked. And I'm like, but I said, look, let's talk about the why. Like, what are the impacts of this thing, and how could it work? And there's a group of them. They did this study to say, okay, the chances of back injuries decreased by this percent. There's all these different things that went into it. Plus, we can get one that really matches our uniform. And they went through. They had in all this kinds of stuff, and I'm like, yeah, well done. Let's go for it. And it was this moment. They're like, cool, we're actually going to do it. I'm like, yeah, you sold me on it, and you came with explaining the why. You came with purpose, and you're showing me that we can be more resilient and safer in what we're doing. Why would I say no to that? But it was beautifully thought out, and there was a lot of work done, and it empowered people to prepare for future leadership roles, because you're giving them a challenge and then you're giving them opportunities to overcome that challenge in a way that they're going to learn. And someday when they're in those higher levels, they're prepared.
For those of you who are only listening and not watching the video, your face was like making me excited about that and like the up and coming generation, and like you looked like you were excited about like those ideas, and what a vast change from like show up, shut up to like, hey, like if you have ideas, problem solve and bring me a solution and I'll actually consider that, and if it's well presented and it makes sense, then we'll implement that. Like I think that that shows adaptability and growth, and I think that that is exciting.
Yeah, I think there's when we talk about the newer generation, and I have a lot of people that I've worked with obviously through the decades, but when we talk about the newer generation of cops, I think they're presented with such a challenge that if they're willing to come on to a profession that, especially 2020 to now, becoming better now in terms of, the public support. But as you look at 2020, the people that signed on to become cops, you really wanted to know their why. And there were some people that really felt strongly like, I can, despite all this noise, all this stuff that's happening, I think I can still make a difference.
Mm.
And so if you're willing to jump in on that and you're willing as a young leader, young professional to jump into this career and then willing to lead, the possibilities with this newer generation are literally incredible with what they can accomplish and how they can take the profession to a whole new level that we've never seen before. So I love it. I'm like all on board. And I think there's a level of understanding of the purpose of empathy and compassion and professional policing beyond anything that maybe we've seen. And that has nothing to do with the people that have come before, but it has to do everything with the opportunity of how our communities view what we're doing and what they expect of us.
But I think too, like you said, preparing future leaders. And when prioritize things like wellness and adaptability and respect and teamwork and all these things, then people who are coming in who have always had that and that has been the culture within the organization are now
Mhm.
going to prioritize that when they step into positions of leadership. And so you can see that kind of snowball effect of things improving over time, and these things being a priority long term, which I think is great. That's what we want. We want, wellness to be at the forefront. And um, I think that everyone always wants things to improve, no matter what it
Yeah.
is, even people who have come before you. Like I would think that, there's that expression of like, I wanted to leave it better than how I found it. And so I think there's always that mentality of like, how can we grow in our role so that we can set up future generations for that growth?
Yeah, and I think the ability to be in a space where you're able to fail forward, and
Mm.
because as human nature, we're going to make mistakes. And, I have so many people in my career that have given to me in such a way, and they didn't have to, really, they didn't have to. But whether it was the first chief that hired me, to my first sergeant, to a field training officer, to other people that I've come in contact with over the years, I think the impacts they've made upon me and have taken the time to invest in me. And then when I've made mistakes, and I've made several, obviously, but the ability to learn from those mistakes and to still feel like I was supported and continue on with learning and those kinds of things. I think failing forward is something that we have to reinforce within organizations because by human nature, we're going to fail. But what if, as a leader, you gave somebody the space to know that it's okay. I did it too, but I'm here. I've got your back, and you're going to get through this, and I'm going to help you do it. I mean, that goes much differently than here's your write up for such and such. Don't do that again. To totally different messages. And that to me, if I'm the officer that gets the former message of, okay, I got your back, they're like, okay, I can do this, and it reemphasizes your desire to go and do the right thing and to become that better level of yourself because you feel like people believe in you.
I love fail forward. I've actually never heard that before. I wrote it down. I think that that is such a powerful message. So thank you for sharing that. Um, I know we're getting close to our time, so there's just a couple things. If you still are with me, there's a
Please, you're
couple
good.
things. So we talked about the up and coming, the newer generation. We talked about this before, how equally important it is to discuss retirees and
Mhm.
you are now retired. And I'd love to talk to you about what that looks like as a transition, for personal and organizational wellness and what that looks like when you step away from the badge and, finding, a new career path or the next thing after retirement.
Yeah, I think for me, there's a level of difficulty in transitioning to not being well, to not being a cop anymore. Um, and I fully realized that as a chief, I really wasn't quote unquote, I'm not out there doing the job all the time. So I still wore the badge and I could still do the duties and I'd show up to calls and, do the things. But I wasn't doing the duty on the regular like the folks out there do. But still, I was very proud to be part of the profession and had served a long time. So when the time started getting closer, and at some point, the reality of it is this, and some people that hang on forever, I think that's fine to an extent, but at some point you got to go. You got to go, and if you're the leader of an organization, sometimes it's better if you do because it allows for the next leader to step up to it better and to keep the organization moves forward with or without you. And you want to leave it better than you got it, all those kinds of things. But as you prepare to step away, it's not just about, okay, I have this job lined up after policing because it's not that easy.
Yeah.
It's stepping away from the camaraderie. It's stepping away from something that you know so very well, and people identify you with it. I mean, I still get called chief. I'm like, you do know that I'm not a chief anymore, right? Like you can just call me Doug. And I was the kind you could call me Doug anyway then. So it didn't really
Mhm.
matter so much. But it was extremely difficult to step away, more than I thought it would be, even with a plan. Um, and you almost have a level of, I would say, when you start something new, a level of imposter syndrome, because, if I've been lucky that I built this great network of people that I know and people that trust me. And, I like to think that I led a career that was ethical and, um, very positive on so many levels. And despite that, though, when you enter into something new after policing, it's all foreign to you and you feel like, gosh, I don't belong here. Like, this is not my space. And this is all this new space. It's like going into a party where you know everybody versus walking into a party and you know nobody. And you're going, oh, okay, well, this is interesting. I don't know anybody here.
Mhm.
And I'll just sort of make my way and figure it out slowly. um, so I think it's difficult to come to terms with that in some way. So preparing for that transition well before the transition is so important. And again, not just the job, but also finding purpose
Mhm.
and then finding passion about whatever it is that you want to do afterwards. And above all else, it doesn't have to be policing related. It doesn't at all have to be policing related. Like you could be like, I want to write a book or I want to, run a Target store or something. I don't, it could be a billion different things. It doesn't matter what it is. As long as it's something that you're passionate about, I think that's super important to have because you still feel like you probably will want to accomplish a mission of some type. You want to be an accountant or a CPA or an attorney or go back to school or whatever it happens to be. But finding that passion's very, very important because when you lose the mission of what you're trying to do, and eventually with time, the people that you worked with, they're going to stop texting as much. They're going to stop calling as much because they're still doing the work back there. And they'll acknowledge you. You'll have the occasional lunch, the occasional dinner, all the things. But after a while, you're going to lose touch and you have to come to terms with that reality. So preparing for it in advance and still feeling confident and comfortable in your own skin and knowing that, you know, Doug the Chief, that was a title. That's not who I was. It was what I did. But Doug's still just Doug. And I have a family and I have friends and all those things. So I'm still who I am. I just have to reinforce that through finding and continuing those passions, whatever those happen to be. And it's challenging. It's really, really hard, especially, I think, for people at a higher level within an organization because you have so many decisions you're making constantly and so many things that are always on you. And while it was amazing stepping away and having one cell phone as opposed to two cell phones
Mhm.
and not worrying about those 2 a.m. calls in the middle of the night and not having to deal with challenges like, city council meetings or angry citizens about things, that's all lovely. Um, you still miss it to some extent, and you still miss that feeling of trying to help people in some way, shape, or form. So having a passion, whether it's a job, whether it's working volunteer work with an organization, finding passion is key. And I think that runs throughout your entire life, though. I don't want to
Yeah,
be the guy that's 80 years old sitting at home, watching the PGA Tour all day and that's my day every day or something. I don't know. That just sounds like something I don't want to do. And I love golf. I'm terrible at it, admittedly. But I want to be active and I want to enjoy life while I have it because it's amazingly short. And I think we take it for granted.
100%. And first of all, thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that because I think that it's great advice for people who are maybe approaching retirement to, like you said, start that transition early, find passion and purpose, but also like asking yourself, like what we go back to, like, why? Like why is it important for you to have a long retirement and what are you going to do during that and how can you find that passion and feel like you have an identity outside of this career choice. And I agree with you that life is so short, and I think the older I get the more I realize that. And when I think about how I want my life long term, like that impacts the decisions I make today. And I think that it's never too early to think about that. Like what vision do you have for your life? Because you are gonna blink. Like I used to be the youngest person in the room, and now I'm like mom. I walk into these police agencies or these academies, and everyone is so young, and I'm like, how did this happen? Like, how did I blink and I'm the old lady in the room with the gray hair that everyone keeps calling me ma'am, which I know is a sign of respect, but also I think they're actually calling me ma'am because I'm the old lady in the room. And so I think it's great advice to, start early, ask yourself like, what you want for your life and then how can you make that happen? How do you think, because I have heard this before where people have said, hey, like I worked this really long career and the day after I retired, it was crickets. Like no one reached out to me. I didn't have that
Yeah.
life at all. How do you think organizations can do a better job supporting their retirees and that transition with, providing wellness resources or an open line of communication? Like what do you think that they could do to help make that transition easier?
I think it's preparing well before that everything takes place. And I've been to countless retirement parties, and we wish everybody well, and we have this lovely showing, and people show up from the community and all the things, and it's great. And then the moment they walk out the door, people are like, "Who?" And it's a really strange phenomenon of like, "Well, yeah, but he retired." And that's great. He did a great job. Yeah, he was really nice. And then we move on to the next thing. So I think it's not only, quite frankly, not always necessarily just the department's job, but it's also falls upon a personal decision to make as you transition out because it's your life afterwards. That policing is a fantastic career, and I would never do it over again any different because I loved it so much, and I still am very passionate about it, as you probably can pick up. But it's a job, and it doesn't define who I am and what I'm about. I did the very best I could, and one thing to be again vulnerable is sometimes after I left, I've been told a few times like, just because you're gone doesn't mean what you did didn't have impact on things. So celebrate those successes. You did a really good job, and I know so many countless professionals that retired and said, and I would tell them like, man, you were one of the best. Like, wow, you just did an awesome job. I'm amazed with all this stuff. And so your accomplishments don't decrease when you leave. Not like the stock market, it doesn't go up and down. What you did is what you accomplished. And so those things are what they are. Take some pride in that and say, you know what? I gave it 100% and I did a great job, but now it's my time. And now it's time for me to do something that I really want to do and I want to focus on, that I want to pour my heart and soul into. And I'm going to do it a little bit more for me this time without it's such great costs. because policing takes a lot out of you. So I think preparing people through the wellness initiatives we talked earlier, whether it's, and we're terrible about it in policing, like talking about investing when you first start in a police department, you're making this money and it's great, it looks great. But so many people are like, I'm going to go buy the best car, I'm going to go do this, I'm going to do that. Start putting your money aside to prepare for the future. And we don't talk about that enough. And it's just one aspect of wellness, like we discussed. So having those resources up front and making sure we support those throughout, and whether it's maybe it's still involved in a spiritual group that's involved with the agency or mentoring or something else. There's so many options that you can be a part of. But at some point, you need to understand that you need to step away. And it's the healthy and right thing to do. And that doesn't mean it doesn't diminish your career or the fact that you did an amazing job. It means that that's the next stage of your life. This is the next chapter, and it's up to you to write it. And at the end of the day, you got to figure out which pen you're going to use to do it.
I feel like we can mic drop right there. Honestly, I think it's such a great thing to say, like, just because you're stepping away does not like negate or diminish the accomplishments that you had. Like you still did that and you still had an impact. And I love the responsibility that you put on the individual of like, now it's your turn. You know, how do you want the rest of your life to play out? Like you get to choose that. So thank you for that. I have one final question before we wrap up. What words of wisdom would you give someone who's earlier in their career when it comes to wellness? Maybe something that you wish you would have known or you wish you would have done earlier.
I think it's be honest about where you are and what you're doing, and pay more attention to others around you in this in what you're in what's happening. I think too many times we don't see warning signs with people before it's too late. Um, I think being present for people is the advice I would give. Be present for other people that you work with, but also take time to be present for yourself and give yourself the grace to do it as you step away and take those days off. Step away, go hike a mountain, go out on the lake, go to some vacation you wanted to go on, go read a book at a local coffee shop. I don't care what it is, but step away and give yourself the grace to just be you and take care of you, because you'll be so much better in the profession for it, not only for yourself but for the community. um, Additionally, if you see somebody struggling or you think, ask the question, and just say, you good, just let you know I'm here for you. You ever want something? Because those small words, and I've had it with me before. I mean, quite frankly, somebody's come in and I'm having a horrible day and all these things are on my mind, and somebody says, hey, you doing all right? I'm fine, because that's what we say. I'm fine, right? And they say, just want to let you know I appreciate you. And it's like, oh, just everything just comes out of you. You're like, you literally just made my day. And all of a sudden that mood change can go 180% different. And you feel like, okay, I got this. And so having other people's back and telling them you got this, and then giving yourself the grace to just be you and take care of yourself, I think is super important.
Thank you. Beautifully said. Great words of advice. I know I said this before, but I was so looking forward to this conversation, and this far exceeded anything I could have possibly have imagined. I really do appreciate your time and your expertise and your insights on wellness, and I appreciate you spending a little extra time with me today. And I know we were slotted for an hour, but it's been like now like an hour and 15. So thank you. Thank you so much.
No, it's my pleasure. And thanks again. Thanks for doing what you're doing. You're doing a great job in the space, and it's appreciated, Paige. It really is.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yep.
We'll stay in
Yep.
touch.
Will do. Thanks you.